He was never the most powerful man in the room. He was never the tallest, the strongest, or the most commanding presence when he walked through a door. He carried a built-up shoe on one foot and a wound in his psychology that never fully healed. The quiet, lifelong wound of a man who had been marked as different before he was old enough to understand what different meant. By every visible measure, he was unremarkable. Small, dark, sharp-featured, with eyes that moved too quickly and a hunger that never quite left them. And yet, at the height of his power, 65 million people heard his voice before they went to sleep at night. He did not build his empire with iron or fire, or not with those alone. He built it with something far more precise and far more dangerous. He built it with words, chosen carefully, with emotions manufactured deliberately, with the slow, patient, devastating art of making an entire nation feel that the story he was telling them was not his story at all, but theirs, their grief, their pride, their enemies, their destiny. He reached into the deepest places of human longing, the need to belong, to be seen, to be part of something larger than the ordinary smallness of daily life, and he filled those places with poison that tasted, to those who drank it, like medicine. Joseph Goebbels never fired a weapon at the front. He never commanded an army or designed a camp or issued the administrative orders that moved the machinery of industrial murder. And yet the Holocaust could not have happened as it did without him. The war could not have lasted as long as it did without him. The willing participation of millions of ordinary Germans in the project of their own civilization's destruction could not have been sustained without him. He was the voice, the architect of belief, the man who stood between reality and the version of reality that an entire nation was permitted to experience, and shaped that gap with the cold, brilliant, remorseless precision of a craftsman who has found at last the work he was always meant to do. His story does not begin with evil. It begins, as the most instructive stories always do, with something far more ordinary and far more human. It begins with a lonely boy in a small German town who wanted more than anything else in the world to be a writer, who wanted to create things that moved people, who submitted his heart in the form of a novel to publisher after publisher and received it back again and again in pieces, who carried that rejection, and the rejection of the body that limped differently, and the rejection of the lover who could not quite love him enough, into a darkening interior where something that had begun as longing slowly, imperceptibly became something else entirely. Tonight, we move through that transformation with the careful attention it deserves, not to excuse, not to explain away, but to understand, because understanding is the only weapon history has ever given us against its own repetition. We will follow this man from the quiet streets of Rheydt to the burning garden of the Reich Chancellery, from the dreaming boy with his novels and his heartbreak to the architect of mass deception who prolonged a war by the sheer force of narrative will, from the first closed door to the final underground room. We will sit with the discomfort of a story that does not allow the comfort of pure distance, that insists with every chapter on the recognition that the mechanisms he mastered are not safely buried in history, that the gap between information and belief, between what is true and what can be made to feel true, is not a gap that closed in 1945, that the most dangerous weapon ever aimed at a civilization is not a bomb or a bullet, but a carefully chosen word delivered to a frightened person at exactly the right moment. So settle in. Let the weight of the evening find its rest. This is a story that asks something of you. Not fear, not despair, but the quiet, steady courage of someone willing to look clearly at a darkness and carry its lesson gently forward into the light. There is a kind of stillness that belongs only to small towns in the early hours of morning. The kind where the streets are empty and the houses hold their breath, and the whole world seems to exist in a state of quiet waiting. Rheydt, Germany, in the final years of the 19th century, was that kind of town. Industrial, modest, proud in the unhurried way of places that have never needed to announce themselves. The chimneys rose, the rivers moved, The families woke early, worked long, and prayed on Sundays with a particular sincerity of people who understood that life offered no guarantees. It was into this world, on the 29th of October, 1897, that Paul Joseph Goebbels arrived. He was the third child of Fritz Goebbels and Katharina Maria Odenhausen, a working-class Catholic couple who kept their home clean, their faith steady, and their ambitions quiet. Fritz worked in a factory. Katharina raised the children with the kind of patient, relentless love that asked nothing in return. They were not wealthy, they were not connected, but they were, by the measures that mattered most to them, respectable. And in a town like Rheydt, respectability was its own kind of currency. Joseph, as he would come to be known, was a small child, dark-eyed, fine-featured, with a sharpness about him that his teachers noticed early. He was not the kind of boy who filled a room with noise. He was the kind who sat in the corner and watched, absorbing everything, cataloging the world with an intensity that was almost unsettling in someone so young. His mother loved him fiercely. His father respected the boy's mind even if he didn't always know what to do with it. And for a few years, the life of young Joseph Goebbels moved forward in the ordinary, unhurried rhythm of a family doing its quiet best. Then illness arrived, as it so often does in stories like this, uninvited, indifferent, and permanent. The exact medical nature of his condition has been debated by historians. Some have said it was polio. Others have pointed to osteomyelitis, a bone infection that in the early 20th century carried no reliable cure. What is not debated is the result. An operation on his right leg left him with a shortened limb, a built-up shoe, and a gait that marked him as different in every room he ever entered. He was perhaps 4 years old when this happened, young enough that the world he woke up into after his recovery was simply the world, the only one he had ever truly known. And yet old enough that the stares had already begun. Old enough that he understood, in the wordless way that children understand the cruelest things, that he would always be the boy who walked differently. There is something important to sit with here, gently and without rushing, because the story of Joseph Goebbels is not a story that begins with evil. It begins, as so many of history's most dangerous lives do, with pain, with a child who wanted nothing more than what every child wants, to belong, to be seen without the shadow of pity, to walk into a room and feel the warmth of acceptance rather than the cool distance of difference. That want is deeply human, and in a different life, in a different story, it might have led somewhere beautiful. Tonight, we simply hold it as the beginning, the first thread in a tapestry that would, decades later, darken everything it touched. Young Joseph compensated, as gifted children often do, with his mind. He read voraciously. He absorbed language the way other boys absorbed sunlight, hungrily, gratefully, as though it were sustenance. The local Catholic school recognized his ability quickly. His teachers wrote of a boy who was diligent, intense, and possessed of a memory that bordered on the extraordinary. He had opinions about things that most children his age hadn't yet thought to notice. He argued with precision and felt things with a depth that made him seem at times older than his years in all the ways that matter and younger in all the ways that hurt. His faith in these early years was genuine. The Goebbels household was devoutly Catholic, and Joseph participated in that faith with the earnestness of a boy who found in its rituals something he could not yet find in the ordinary world, a sense of meaning, of structure, of belonging to something larger than himself. There are accounts of him serving as an altar boy, of his deep engagement with the language and ceremony of the church. It would be easy, and perhaps tempting, to draw a straight line from this early religious devotion to his later political fanaticism, to see in both the same hunger for a transcendent cause, the same need to surrender the self to something absolute. But history rarely rewards straight lines, and tonight we are only at the beginning. The years of Joseph Goebbels' adolescence moved with the particular quiet intensity of a student who has decided, somewhere deep and unspoken, that the mind would be his way through the world. If the body had betrayed him, language would not. If the physical world had marked him as lesser, the intellectual world offered no such cruelty. In books, in ideas, in the long, beautiful corridors of literature and philosophy, Everyone moved at the same pace. Everyone was equal. And Joseph Goebbels, limping through the schoolyards of Rheydt, found in that equality something close to oxygen. He excelled. There is no softer word for it. His academic record was, by any measure, remarkable. He moved through his early schooling with a consistency that impressed his teachers and, one imagines, quietly satisfied his parents in the way that only a child's achievements can, as a kind of vindication, a proof that the hardships had not broken anything essential. He had a particular gift for language, for the rhythm and weight of German prose, for the way a sentence could be constructed to carry not just meaning, but feeling. He was also drawn to history, to the grand sweep of empires and ideas, to the question of how the world had become what it was, and who, precisely, had shaped it. By the time he reached his later school years, the world outside Rheydt had begun to change in ways that would eventually swallow everything. It was the early 20th century. Europe was shifting. The old certainties, the empires, the hierarchies, the quiet confidence of the established order were beginning to show their cracks. And Germany, proud and industrial and increasingly anxious, could feel the tremors beneath its feet, even if it could not yet name what was coming. For young Goebbels, these years were defined more by personal aspiration than political awareness. He wanted, with a clarity that was almost romantic in its simplicity, to be a writer. Not a journalist, not a pamphleteer, a writer in the fullest and most serious sense of the word. He wanted to create literature that mattered, stories that moved people, words that would outlast him. This was not arrogance, or not only arrogance. It was the sincere ambition of a young man who had spent his childhood in books and believed, with the unguarded faith of the not yet disappointed, that he had something worth saying. His family, recognizing the unusual quality of his mind, made sacrifices to support his education. This was not a small thing for a working-class Catholic household in early 20th century Germany. Money was carefully managed, decisions were weighed, and yet there was a collective sense in the Goebbels home that Joseph was different, that his path would not follow the familiar contours of factory work and modest comfort that had defined the family before him. Whether this was pride or premonition, history does not tell us. Perhaps it was simply love, doing what love always does, believing in someone more completely than the evidence strictly requires. He went on to university. And here, the story of Joseph Goebbels takes on a texture that is both impressive and quietly melancholy. He studied at multiple institutions: Bonn, Freiburg, Würzburg, Munich, and finally Heidelberg, where he would earn his doctorate in 1921. He studied German philology and literature, immersing himself in the great works of the German tradition, in the philosophy of the Romantics, in the drama of Goethe and Schiller, in the dense and intoxicating world of German intellectual life. He was a serious student, a genuinely serious one, not merely performing diligence, but living inside ideas with the complete absorption of someone who has found in the life of the mind the only home that has ever felt entirely welcoming. At Heidelberg, he completed a doctoral dissertation on a relatively obscure 18th century romantic dramatist named Wilhelm von Schütz. The work was competent, careful, and intellectually honest, the product of a young man who understood the rules of academic inquiry and had followed them faithfully. His supervisor approved it. The degree was conferred, and Joseph Goebbels became, at 23, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, a title he would carry for the rest of his life with a pride that never quite dimmed, even as the world around him descended into catastrophe. There is something almost tender about this detail if you sit with it long enough. In all the years that followed, through the rallies and the radio broadcasts, through the propaganda campaigns and the calculated cruelties, he insisted on the title, Doctor. It meant something to him that went beyond vanity. It was a credential from a world that had taken him seriously on its own terms, before politics, before power, before the machinery of ideology had swallowed everything else. It was, perhaps, the last purely earned thing he ever had. But the doctorate was also, in its way, the beginning of the disappointments, because the world that had granted him the degree was not, it turned out, particularly interested in what he wanted to do with it. There is a particular species of heartbreak that belongs exclusively to the creative soul. It is not the sharp, sudden pain of losing something you had. It is the slow, grinding ache of reaching for something you can almost touch, something you have built your entire sense of self around, and finding, again and again, that your fingers close on empty air. Joseph Goebbels emerged from Heidelberg in 1921 with his doctorate, his ambitions, and a heart full of literary longing. He was going to write. He was going to matter. The world, he was quite certain, was waiting for him. The world, it turned out, was not. He wrote a novel. He called it Michael, a semi-autobiographical work deeply romantic in its sensibility, full of the yearning and intensity that characterized everything Goebbels touched in these early years. The protagonist was a young German intellectual searching for meaning, for purpose, for a cause worthy of his passion. It was, in many ways, a portrait of Goebbels himself, thinly disguised, emotionally raw, and written with the kind of urgent sincerity that first novels often carry. He submitted it to publishers. He waited. He hoped with the particular, painful hopefulness of someone who has staked something essential on the outcome. It was rejected. Not once, but repeatedly. Publisher after publisher passed on Michael, citing various reasons: the market, the timing, the style. Each rejection arrived like a small verdict, and collectively they began to accumulate into something heavier than disappointment. They began to feel like a judgment on the man himself. This is the peculiar cruelty of creative rejection. It rarely feels professional. It always feels personal. He tried other avenues. He wrote plays. He submitted essays and articles to newspapers and literary journals. He reached out to editors, to cultural figures, to anyone who might open a door into the world of German letters that he so desperately wanted to inhabit. Some pieces were published, here and there, in small publications that paid little and reached few. But the breakthrough he had imagined, the moment when the world would recognize him as the serious literary voice he believed himself to be, simply never came. And so he drifted. Through the early 1920s, Goebbels moved through a series of unremarkable jobs: clerical work, a position at a bank that he found soul-destroying, odd assignments that kept him fed but did nothing to quiet the restlessness that had settled into him like weather. He was, by his own account in his diaries, which he kept with obsessive regularity throughout his adult life, deeply unhappy during these years. Not in the quiet, resigned way of someone who has made peace with diminished expectations, but in the hot, restless way of someone who remains entirely convinced that he deserves more than he is receiving. His diaries from this period are remarkable documents. They reveal a young man of genuine complexity, self-aware enough to recognize his own contradictions, but not quite self-aware enough to examine them honestly. He writes about loneliness with real feeling. He writes about his physical difference with a rawness that is sometimes almost unbearable to read. He describes encounters with people who look past him, social situations where he feels invisible, moments of humiliation, both real and imagined, that he catalogues with the precision of someone building a case, against whom he has not yet fully decided. There were women, too, always women in his diaries, written about with a romantic intensity that swings between adoration and resentment with a speed that is, in retrospect, unsettling. He fell in love repeatedly and completely in the way that only very lonely people can, surrendering entirely to the feeling, needing it to mean more than perhaps it could. Several relationships ended painfully, one with a young woman named Anke Stahlhelm, whom he had known since his student days, carried on in an agonized on-again, off-again pattern that consumed years of his emotional life. She was not Jewish, a detail that matters only because of what Goebbels would later become and the bitter irony it casts backward over these years. She was simply a woman who could not quite love him as completely as he needed to be loved. All of this, the rejections, the loneliness, the failed relationships, the sense of being perpetually on the outside of a warmth he could see but never quite reach, was composting into something in the psychological interior of Joseph Goebbels. It would be too simple and, frankly, too convenient to say that his later monstrousness was merely the product of personal pain. Millions of people carry pain and choose decency. History is full of the disappointed, the overlooked, the physically marked, the romantically wounded, and most of them do not go on to engineer the suffering of millions. Pain explains nothing on its own. But pain combined with ideology, combined with opportunity, combined with a particular kind of brilliance that is utterly without moral anchor, that combination is something else entirely.
And in the early 1920s, all of those ingredients were quietly assembling themselves inside a small, sharp-eyed young man from Rheydt who had not yet found the stage he was looking for. He did not know it yet, but it was coming. And when it arrived, it would not look like literature. It would not look like the quiet recognition he had dreamed of in his university room. It would look like a movement, like a crowd, like a voice on a radio reaching into every living room in Germany. But that was still ahead. For now, there was only the drift, the waiting, the slow, burning certainty that he was meant for something if only the world would stop being so inexplicably blind to the fact. The year was 1924. Germany was fracturing, and Joseph Goebbels, 37 rejections deep into a literary career that had never quite started, was about to discover politics.
Germany in the early 1920s was not a country at peace with itself. It was a nation wearing the heavy, ill-fitting coat of defeat, a coat it had not chosen and could not seem to take off. The First World War had ended in 1918, and with it had come the Treaty of Versailles, that long, punishing document that carved away German territory, dismantled its military, and attached to the German people a clause of war guilt that burned like an open wound in the national consciousness. Reparations bled the economy. Inflation arrived with a cruelty that is almost impossible to imagine from a comfortable distance. A cruelty where a wheelbarrow of banknotes could not buy a loaf of bread, where savings accumulated over lifetimes dissolved overnight, where the ordinary dignity of working-class life simply evaporated in the heat of economic collapse. Into this fractured, humiliated, deeply anxious Germany, political movements multiplied like shadows in a darkening room. Communists and nationalists fought in the streets. Intellectuals debated in cafes, while outside the windows, the world they were debating was already changing faster than their arguments could follow. Everyone, it seemed, had a theory about what had gone wrong. Everyone had a villain. Everyone had a cure. And the German people, exhausted and frightened and hungry for something solid to hold on to, were listening with the desperate attentiveness of a drowning person reaching for anything that might float. Goebbels found his way into this world gradually, and then all at once. His early political sympathies were, perhaps surprisingly, not straightforwardly right-wing. He was drawn initially to certain strands of socialist thought, not the international Marxism that the nationalist movements despised, but a more romantic, nationalist version of socialism that imagined a Germany reborn in solidarity, purified of the influences that, in this poisoned political climate, were increasingly being blamed for all of its suffering. He read widely and passionately across the political spectrum. He argued, he wrote. He was searching, as he had always been searching, for a framework large enough to contain his ambitions and his grievances simultaneously. He encountered the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, in this period of searching. His initial engagement was cautious, intellectually restless in the way that was characteristic of him. He was not the kind of man who joined things lightly. He needed to be convinced, needed to feel that the ideas were worthy of his considerable mind, needed to believe that he was choosing rather than simply being swept along. And in the early days of his engagement with the movement, he actually positioned himself within a more left-leaning faction, closer to the Strasser brothers, Gregor and Otto, who represented a more genuinely socialist interpretation of National Socialism, one that was skeptical of Hitler's more autocratic tendencies. This is a detail that history sometimes glosses over in the interest of a cleaner narrative, the fact that Goebbels was not always Hitler's man, that there was a period, brief but real, when he looked at the movement with something approaching critical distance, when he wrote in his diary of Hitler with ambivalence, when he was genuinely uncertain about where his political loyalties should settle. He was, in these years, still a man with some capacity for independent thought, still in some small measure his own person. That would change. But the change, when it came, did not arrive through argument or persuasion in any ordinary sense. It arrived through something far more primal, far more difficult to reason with. It arrived through the experience of hearing Adolf Hitler speak. There is a scene that Goebbels describes in his diary with an intensity that is almost religious in its quality. He attended a speech by Hitler, one of those long, escalating performances that Hitler was already becoming famous for,
that strange alchemy of grievance and vision and physical theater that seemed to bypass the rational mind entirely and reach directly into something older, deeper, and less defensible. And Goebbels, who had spent his entire life in love with language, who had studied rhetoric and literature and the mechanics of how words move people, Goebbels sat in that room and felt something unlock inside him. He wrote afterward that he had wept, that he had felt for the first time in as long as he could remember that he was in the presence of someone truly great, not merely capable or impressive, but great in the way that he had always imagined greatness must feel, vast and consuming and utterly certain of itself. Hitler in that room was everything that Goebbels had tried and failed to be in his literary years. He commanded attention without begging for it. He moved people without the awkward vulnerability of a writer submitting his heart to a publisher's judgment. He stood at the center of the room, and the room reorganized itself around him, and no one thought about his appearance or his background or the circumstances of his birth. For a man who had spent 30 years feeling like the person at the edge of every room, this was not merely impressive, it was intoxicating.
The conversion of Joseph Goebbels to Hitler's cause was not the work of a single evening, though that evening in the meeting hall planted something that would not stop growing. It moved through him in the weeks and months that followed like a slow tide, gradually, then completely rearranging everything it touched. He returned to his diary with a new urgency, filling pages with the particular excitement of a man who has found, after years of wandering, something that feels like solid ground beneath his feet. The restlessness that had defined his 20s began, for the first time, to quiet. Not because his ambitions had diminished, but because at last they had found a vessel large enough to hold them. He wrote to Hitler, directly, personally, with the unguarded earnestness of someone who has decided that caution is a luxury he can no longer afford. He offered himself, his pen, his voice, his considerable gifts for language and persuasion to the movement. And Hitler, who had an almost predatory instinct for recognizing useful talent, responded. The two men met, and in that meeting something was confirmed that the speech had only suggested, that these were two people who needed each other in ways that went beyond the merely political. Hitler needed what Goebbels had. He needed someone who could translate the raw, volcanic emotion of his speeches into the cooler, more lasting medium of the written word. Someone who could reach the educated, the intellectual, the skeptical, the people who might be moved by a rally, but who needed something more structured, more reasoned in its surface appearance to fully commit. Hitler was a performer of genius, but he was not, in any serious sense, a writer or a systematic thinker. He needed a mind that could build the architecture around his instincts. And Goebbels, with his doctorate and his literary training and his ferocious, underutilized intelligence, was precisely that mind. What Goebbels needed from Hitler is both simpler and more complicated to articulate. On the surface, he needed what the movement could provide: a platform, an audience, a purpose that felt commensurate with his abilities. After years of rejection, here was a world that would not only accept his gifts, but place them at the center of something enormous. Here was a stage that dwarfed anything the literary world had ever offered him. But beneath the surface, the need was older and more personal than any of that. He needed to believe, to give himself over completely to something larger than his own loneliness, to trade the exhausting freedom of the independent intellectual for the warm, consuming certainty of absolute devotion. In Hitler, he found someone to worship, and in Goebbels, Hitler found someone whose worship he could use. By 1926, the relationship had solidified enough that Hitler appointed Goebbels as Gauleiter, the regional party leader of Berlin. It was, on its face, a thankless assignment. Berlin in 1926 was not Nazi territory. It was a city of cosmopolitan culture, of leftist politics, of the vibrant, complicated, dangerously alive energy that characterized Weimar Germany at its most creative and most fragile. The Communist Party was strong there. The working class was organized and resistant. The newspapers were skeptical, sometimes openly hostile. Sending Goebbels to Berlin was, in some interpretations, a test, perhaps even a punishment for his earlier associations with the Strasser faction. Here, Hitler seemed to be saying, make something of this, if you can. Goebbels could. What he did in Berlin over the next several years is, even viewed through the cold lens of hindsight, a masterclass in political communication. He understood intuitively that you do not win a hostile city by arguing with it. You win it by making yourself impossible to ignore. He provoked.
He staged confrontations with communist groups, ensuring that the resulting violence made headlines. He published a newspaper, Der Angriff, The Attack, that was inflammatory, personal, and relentlessly entertaining in the way that all effective propaganda must be. He organized rallies in working-class neighborhoods, not in the comfortable venues where the converted gathered to applaud each other, but in the streets and halls where the unconverted lived, making the case in the language and register that those audiences understood. He was brilliant at this, painfully, undeniably brilliant. He had the propagandist's essential gift, the ability to make complex things feel simple and simple things feel profound. He could take a grievance that was real and legitimate, the economic suffering of ordinary Germans, the genuine humiliations of the post-war settlement, and attach it to an explanation that was false and monstrous in a way that felt not just plausible, but inevitable. He understood that people do not primarily reason their way to their beliefs, they feel their way there. And if you can reach them at the level of feeling, if you can make them feel seen and wronged and capable of righteous response, the reasoning will follow, or it won't be needed at all. His diaries from the Berlin years crackle with energy. The exhaustion and depression of his early 20s have largely given way to a driven, purposeful intensity. He is working 18-hour days. He is speaking, writing, organizing, provoking. He is, for the first time in his life, exactly where he wants to be, at the center of something that feels like history being made. And if there is something troubling about the joy he takes in this work, something that a careful reader of his diary entries might pause over, the relish with which he describes the chaos he engineers, the cold satisfaction in the faces of opponents he has outmaneuvered, well, that troubled feeling is worth sitting with. It is, in fact, one of the most important feelings this story has to offer. Because what is happening in Berlin in the late 1920s is not merely the rise of a political movement, it is the discovery by a deeply damaged and deeply gifted man that he can make the world feel his presence at last, that after all the years of closed doors and turned backs and quiet dismissals, he has found a way to make people pay attention. The method is irrelevant to him, the attention is everything. And in that terrible, all-consuming need for attention, the last threads of whatever moral compass he might once have possessed are quietly, almost imperceptibly, coming loose.
There is a moment in the life of every ideologue when the ideas stop being tools and start being truth, when the arguments that began as instruments of persuasion become the actual landscape of the mind, when the propagandist, in other words, becomes the most thoroughly propagandized person in the room. For Joseph Goebbels, that moment is difficult to pinpoint precisely. It may not have been a single moment at all. It may have been a gradual process, so slow and so complete that he never noticed it happening, the way a room fills with water, not all at once, but drop by drop, until one morning you wake and find yourself submerged. What is clear is that by the late 1920s, Goebbels was no longer simply performing belief. He had arrived somewhere that felt, to him, like genuine conviction, the anti-Semitism that would become the central organizing principle of Nazi ideology, that dark, ancient hatred dressed in the borrowed clothes of modern pseudoscience, had settled into him not as a calculated political position, but as something that felt, from the inside, like understanding, like having finally identified the hidden mechanism behind all of Germany's suffering, like clarity. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of Goebbels' story, and one of the most important to sit with honestly, because it would be more comfortable, in some ways, to believe that the architects of such catastrophic evil knew at some level that they were lying, that behind the rhetoric and the rallies there was a private room where they acknowledged the truth and chose the lie anyway. Some of them perhaps did operate that way. But Goebbels, by the evidence of his own extraordinarily detailed diaries, appears to have genuinely believed. He had taken the poison and mistaken it for medicine. And a man who believes his poison is medicine will administer it with the full, compassionate urgency of someone trying to heal. The political landscape of Germany was shifting rapidly around him. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 with the force of a second catastrophe layered over the still unhealed wounds of the first. Unemployment exploded. The middle class, which had only recently begun to recover some stability after the inflation years, watched its savings and security dissolve again. Fear moved through the country like weather, cold, pervasive, impossible to shelter from. And in that fear, the extremist movements on both left and right found their most fertile ground.
People who are comfortable and secure can afford the luxury of nuance. People who are frightened and hungry reach for the most certain-sounding voice in the room. Goebbels understood this with the instinctive precision of a great diagnostician. He understood that the Depression was not merely an economic crisis, but a psychological one, a crisis of meaning, of identity, of the basic human need to believe that the suffering has a reason and the reason has a cure. And he shaped the Nazi message accordingly, with a sensitivity to the emotional temperature of the German public that was, in purely technical terms, extraordinary. He was not simply telling people what they wanted to hear. He was telling them what they were already half feeling, in language cleaner and more certain than they had managed to find for themselves. He was naming the monster under the bed, and in the terrible relief of having it named, many people stopped asking whether the name was true. The elections of the early 1930s told the story in numbers. The Nazi Party, which had been a fringe movement through most of the 1920s, began its rapid ascent into mainstream German politics. In the 1928 federal elections, they had received less than 3% of the vote. By 1930, riding the wave of Depression-era desperation, they received nearly 18%. By July 1932, they were the largest single party in the Reichstag, with over 37%. The trajectory was not inevitable, history never is, but it was, in retrospect, legible, and Goebbels' propaganda operation was one of the primary engines driving it. He had, by this point, developed a complete philosophy of political communication that was decades ahead of its time. He understood the importance of repetition, that a lie told once is merely a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times in 1,000 different registers begins to acquire the texture of fact. He understood the power of the visual, the carefully choreographed rallies, the forests of flags, the geometric precision of massed bodies that made the movement look not merely large, but inevitable. He understood the importance of the enemy, that people unite not only around what they love, but around what they fear, and that a movement without a clear enemy is a movement without sufficient energy to sustain itself. And he understood, perhaps most dangerously of all, the power of modern technology. Radio was still relatively new. Cinema was finding its voice. The mass media landscape of the early 1930s was, by contemporary standards, primitive, but it was also, precisely because of its novelty, enormously powerful. People trusted what came through the radio in a way they might not have trusted a pamphlet or a poster, because the radio voice felt intimate, personal, direct. It felt like someone speaking to you specifically in your home in the quiet of your evening. Goebbels saw this clearly and immediately. He saw that the distance between a political movement and the inside of every German household had just collapsed to the length of a radio wave, and he began with quiet, systematic thoroughness to plan what he would do with that intimacy when the moment arrived. That moment was coming faster than almost anyone realized. In the corridors of German political power, deals were being made and unmade with dizzying speed. President Hindenburg, old and increasingly frail, was being maneuvered by advisors who believed, with the catastrophic miscalculation that would echo through the rest of the century, that Hitler could be controlled, that the Nazi movement could be invited into legitimate government and tamed by it, that the raw energy of the streets could be domesticated by the responsibilities of office. On the 30th of January, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Goebbels heard the news and wept again, but these were not the tears of the uncertain young man who had wept at a speech in a provincial meeting hall. These were the tears of someone standing at the edge of everything he had worked for, looking out over a horizon that suddenly had no visible limit. He wrote in his diary that it felt like a dream, that he could barely believe it was real, that Germany at last had found its destiny. What Germany had found, though neither he nor most of the world yet understood the full shape of it, was something else entirely. It had found the machinery of its own destruction, assembled piece by piece with extraordinary care and intelligence by men who had convinced themselves that what they were building was salvation. The dream that Goebbels recorded in his diary on that January night would within 12 years become something that no language he possessed, not the language of the novelist, not the language of the propagandist, not the language of the true believer, would be adequate to describe. But on that night, in the cold hours of a new and terrible era, Joseph Goebbels simply wept with joy. And somewhere in the darkened streets of Berlin, the machinery began to turn.
Power, when it finally arrives after years of hunger, does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, almost tenderly, like the first warmth of a fire you have been trying to light for a very long time. For Joseph Goebbels, the weeks and months following Hitler's appointment as Chancellor carried exactly that quality, a slow, spreading warmth that moved through every corner of his life, illuminating rooms that had been dark for as long as he could remember. He was 35 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade in the grinding, unglamorous work of building a movement from the margins inward. And now, at last, the margins had become the center. The movement had become the government. And Joseph Goebbels, the limping boy from Rheydt who had wanted nothing more than to matter, was standing at the very heart of it. On the 13th of March, 1933, 6 weeks after Hitler's appointment, Goebbels was named Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The title was new. The ministry itself was newly created, carved out specifically for him, a recognition that what he did was considered essential enough to deserve its own apparatus of state. He was given authority over the press, radio, film, theater, music, the visual arts, and literature. In other words, he was given authority over the entire cultural life of a nation of 65 million people. Every story told in Germany, every song played on the radio, every film projected in every darkened cinema, every painting hung on every gallery wall, every word printed in every newspaper, all of it now passed through the hands of one man. He moved into the ministry with the energy of someone who has been waiting for exactly this room for exactly this long. The building on Wilhelmplatz was grand in the way that Weimar-era German government buildings tended to be, serious, imposing, built to communicate permanence and authority. Goebbels redecorated it. He brought in modern furniture, clean lines, the aesthetic of a man who understood that even the physical environment of power sends a message. He assembled a staff, young, energetic, loyal, many of them genuinely talented in the fields they had been recruited from. He held daily briefings that were, by all accounts, extraordinary performances in themselves, rapid, precise, charged with the particular electricity of a man who was doing exactly what he was built to do. He was, in these early months, operating at a speed and intensity that impressed even people who feared him. He worked without apparent fatigue. He dictated memoranda, received delegations, attended screenings and performances, monitored the output of every major German media organization simultaneously, and still found time to write in his diary each evening with the obsessive regularity that had characterized him since his student days. The diary entries from this period have a quality that is almost manic in its brightness, a relentless forward momentum, a sense of history being seized and shaped by willing hands. He was, he wrote repeatedly, living the life he had always been meant to live, doing the work he had always been meant to do. And the work, in its earliest phase, moved with remarkable speed. Within weeks of taking office, Goebbels had begun the systematic restructuring of German cultural life that would, over the following years, transform it beyond recognition. The first and most visible instrument of this transformation was the Reich Chamber of Culture, an organization he created and led which divided German cultural life into 7 chambers covering press, radio, film, theater, music, fine arts, and literature. In other words, he was given authority over the entire cultural life of a nation of 65 million people. Every story told in Germany, every song played on the radio, every film projected in every darkened cinema, every painting hung on every gallery wall, every word printed in every newspaper, all of it now passed through the hands of one man. There is a psychological ugliness to this that deserves to be named carefully. The young man who had submitted his novel Michael to publisher after publisher and received rejection after rejection was now, in effect, the only publisher that mattered. The aspiring playwright whose work had never found a stage was now in charge of every stage in Germany. The literary dreamer who had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that his voice was not wanted, that man now had the power to silence every other voice. Whether he was conscious of this symmetry is impossible to say with certainty, but the diaries suggest, in their texture and their tone, that the power over culture carried a personal charge for Goebbels that went beyond the merely political. It was not just useful.
It felt at some level like justice.
The book burnings began in May of 1933. It is one of those historical images so stark, so elementally symbolic, that it has a tendency to overwhelm the details around it, to become icon rather than event, symbol rather than story. But the details matter. They always matter. Because in the details, the human beings come back into focus, and with them, the full weight of what was actually happening. The burnings were organized primarily by the German Student Union, a body that had aligned itself enthusiastically with the new regime and was eager to demonstrate its loyalty through visible, dramatic action. But the ideological framework, the lists of offending authors, the cultural logic that justified the flames, all of that bore Goebbels' fingerprints. He had not invented the idea of burning books. The image reached back through centuries of human history, through every era in which those with power had decided that certain ideas were too dangerous to be allowed to exist in physical form. But Goebbels understood the image's power with the instinct of a man trained in literature and theater. He understood that fire, in the right context, does not merely destroy, it declares, it announces, it draws a line between what was and what will be, in a language that requires no translation. On the night of the 10th of May 1933 in the Opernplatz in Berlin, a square overlooked by the Humboldt University where some of the greatest minds in German academic history had lectured and studied, tens of thousands of books were burned. Students in torchlight carried volumes by Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Heinrich Heine, Erich Maria Remarque, and hundreds of others to the pyre with the ceremonial seriousness of a religious rite. Goebbels himself was present. He spoke. His voice rose over the crackling of the flames, and he told the crowd that the age of extreme Jewish intellectualism had ended and that the German soul could now emerge from these flames. Heinrich Heine, one of the authors whose books burned that night, had written a century earlier that where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also. It is one of history's most devastating prophecies. And it was confirmed with a thoroughness that Heine could not have imagined in the decade that followed that May evening in the Opernplatz. But in the moment, standing before the flames, Goebbels was not thinking about prophecy. He was thinking about power, about the clean, declarative simplicity of a bonfire that says, without ambiguity, that a new order has arrived and the old one is ash. The radio project moved in parallel with the cultural purge, and in many ways it was Goebbels' most far-reaching and consequential achievement. He had understood the medium's potential from the beginning, but understanding potential and realizing it are different things, and what he accomplished with German radio in the years following 1933 was, by any measure, extraordinary. He pushed aggressively for the mass production of affordable radio receivers, the Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver, a small, inexpensive device that was manufactured and distributed at a scale designed specifically to ensure that no German household would be without one. By the mid-1930s, Germany had the highest rate of radio ownership in the world. Goebbels had effectively built a direct line into every German home. What traveled through that line was carefully, obsessively managed. News broadcasts were scripted and supervised. Commentary was controlled. Music was curated to reinforce the emotional register that the regime wanted its citizens to inhabit: proud, energized, certain, united. Foreign broadcasts that might carry contradictory information were jammed or made technically difficult to receive. The radio, in Goebbels' hands, became not merely a communication tool, but an environmental condition, a constant, ambient presence in German daily life that quietly, persistently shaped the emotional and informational landscape in which ordinary people made their ordinary decisions. He was equally attentive to film. German cinema in the Weimar period had been extraordinary, expressionist, adventurous, psychologically complex, the work of a film culture that was genuinely among the most innovative in the world. Under Goebbels, it became something different. Not immediately, and not without some internal tension. He had genuine aesthetic sensibilities and was capable of appreciating quality even in work that didn't serve his purposes, which created occasional complications in his role as cultural overseer. He admired certain Hollywood productions with a frankness that his ideological commitments should perhaps have prohibited. He understood that heavy-handed propaganda made for bad cinema, and bad cinema emptied the theaters, and empty theaters served no one's purposes. So the approach to film was more nuanced than simple agitprop.
Goebbels encouraged the production of entertainment films, comedies, romances, adventure stories that carried ideological messages lightly, embedded in narrative rather than announced from a podium. The idea was that a population kept entertained and emotionally satisfied would be more receptive in its general mood to the larger messages the regime needed it to absorb. Cinema would not always preach. Sometimes it would simply comfort, and in that comfort lower its audience's guard. The explicitly propagandistic films existed too, of course. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, documenting the 1934 Nuremberg rally, was the most celebrated and the most technically accomplished, a film that used the full vocabulary of cinematic art in the service of political myth-making, and that remains, to this day, one of the most studied and most troubling works in the history of the medium. Goebbels had a complicated relationship with Riefenstahl. He admired her talent and resented her independence in roughly equal measure. But the film served his purposes, and he understood its value with the cold clarity that characterized all his professional judgments. What he was building across all these platforms simultaneously was not merely a propaganda apparatus. It was something more total and more ambitious than that. He was attempting to construct a reality, to create, through the coordinated management of every information channel available to him, a version of the world that Germans would inhabit so completely, so continuously, that the question of whether it was true would simply cease to arise. Truth, in Goebbels' architecture, was not a fixed point that communication either hit or missed. It was a product, something manufactured, distributed, and consumed, something that could be engineered. This is the idea at the heart of his legacy, and it is worth sitting with in the quiet of this evening, with the particular attention that quiet allows. Because the machinery Goebbels built did not disappear with the regime that commissioned it. The insights he developed about repetition, about emotional resonance, about the management of information environments, about the gap between what people know and what they feel, those insights outlasted him. They entered the permanent toolkit of political communication worldwide. Every modern propagandist, every spin doctor, every architect of information warfare works in a landscape that Goebbels helped to shape, not because they admire him necessarily, but because he was right about how it works, and that rightness is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of his entire story.
There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to the person who has made themselves indispensable. It is not the loneliness of the overlooked or the forgotten. Those hungers Goebbels knew well from his earlier years. It is subtler, and in some ways more corrosive than that. It is the loneliness of the person who is always needed and never truly known, who exists, in the eyes of everyone around them, primarily as a function, as the thing they can do rather than the person doing it. By the mid-1930s, Joseph Goebbels had become indispensable to the Nazi regime in exactly this way. And the private life that ran alongside his public one, the marriage, the children, the romantic entanglements, the quiet hours in his diary, carried the particular texture of a man who had traded intimacy for significance, and was not always certain he had made the right exchange. He had married Magda Quandt in 1931. She was beautiful, composed, socially accomplished, and possessed of a cool intelligence that complemented his volatile intensity in ways that made them, on the surface, a formidable pair. She had been previously married to a wealthy industrialist, had a son from that marriage, and brought to the relationship a social ease and personal elegance that Goebbels, for all his public brilliance, sometimes lacked in private settings. Hitler adored her, reportedly considered her the ideal of German womanhood, which gave the marriage a political dimension that was never entirely separable from its personal one. They were, in the social architecture of the Third Reich, a model couple, photographed, celebrated, displayed. The reality was considerably more complicated. Goebbels was constitutionally incapable of fidelity. His diaries trace a restless, compulsive pattern of romantic and sexual pursuit that ran throughout his marriage like a second, parallel narrative. Actresses, socialites, women encountered at the ministry, women encountered at film screenings, women encountered almost anywhere that women of a certain type could be found. He pursued them with the same intensity he brought to everything else, fell into infatuation quickly and completely, and then moved on with a speed that suggests the pursuit mattered more to him than the arrival. He was, in his romantic life, as in his political one, always reaching for something just beyond his grasp.
The most serious of these affairs, and the one that came closest to genuine crisis, was with a Czech actress, Lida Bauerova, which began in 1936 and consumed him with an abandon that was, by his own account, unlike anything he had felt before. He wrote about her in his diary with an unguarded tenderness that is almost startling in its contrast to the cold, calculating intelligence that characterized his professional writings. He wanted to leave Magda for her. He actually approached Hitler, his Führer, his idol, the man to whom he had devoted his entire adult life, and requested permission to divorce. It is a moment that reveals, with uncomfortable clarity, the degree to which Goebbels had surrendered his personal autonomy to the regime, that he needed to ask, that he framed it as a request, that he genuinely believed it might be granted. Hitler refused, flatly, personally, with the authority of a man who understood that the model couple was politically useful and personal happiness was irrelevant by comparison. He ordered Goebbels to end the affair and repair his marriage. And Goebbels, who had built an entire career on the manufacture of absolute loyalty, complied. He ended it. He returns to Magda. He continued. And in the diary entries that follow this episode, there is a quality that had not been fully present before, a muted quality, a slight dimming of the relentless brightness that had characterized his earlier entries. Not defeat, exactly, but a recognition, perhaps for the first time, of the precise dimensions of the cage he had built around himself. Because this is what the story of Goebbels and Hitler ultimately is, beneath all the history and the horror and the politics. It is the story of a man who gave everything into another man's vision, and in doing so, gave away the only things that could not be replaced: his independent judgment, his capacity for genuine relationship, his ability to hear the quiet voice inside himself that might in another life have said, "This is wrong. Stop. Turn back." That voice, if it ever spoke to him, was drowned long before the Bauerova affair, drowned in the noise of rallies and radio broadcasts and the intoxicating daily business of being necessary to something enormous. And yet the private man persisted, in fragments, in the margins of the public one. He was, by multiple accounts, genuinely devoted to his children, the 6 children he and Magda would eventually have together, the ones he called his greatest joy in diary entries that carry a warmth entirely different from anything he wrote about politics or power. He took them to the park. He read to them. He was present in their lives in ways that the demands of his position might easily have precluded had he chosen differently. This detail is not offered as mitigation. Nothing in the private life of Joseph Goebbels mitigates what he did in his public one. But it is offered as part of the complete picture, because the complete picture is the only one that tells us anything true. The man who loved his children was the same man who controlled the apparatus that would within a few years oversee the most systematic program of human destruction in recorded history. The man who wept over a lost love was the same man who engineered the dehumanization of millions with cold professional precision. The man who had once dreamed of writing novels that moved people was the same man who used every tool of emotional manipulation available to him to move an entire nation towards catastrophe. These are not separate men. They are one man. And that is perhaps the most disturbing truth that his story has to offer. Not that evil is alien and recognizable and other, but that it can coexist in the same human being with tenderness and grief and the ordinary aching desire to be loved. Outside the windows of the ministry, outside the carefully managed world of radio broadcasts and film screenings and choreographed rallies, the darker machinery was already turning. The Nuremberg laws in 1935 had stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship. The violence that had been simmering in street-level politics was being institutionalized, legalized, given the cold authority of the state. And Goebbels, with his ministry and his microphone and his undiminished gift for making the terrible sound reasonable, was one of its primary architects and its most tireless advocate. The night of November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, would make that advocacy impossible to ignore, even for those who had managed, until then, to look away. It was a pogrom, organized, coordinated, and incited, in which synagogues across Germany and Austria were burned, Jewish businesses were destroyed, and tens of thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It was not spontaneous. It was engineered. And the speech that ignited it, delivered to Nazi party leaders in Munich on the evening of the 9th, was delivered by Joseph Goebbels. He stood before them and spoke with the full force of everything he had learned about how words move people. And the people moved into the streets with fire. He wrote about it in his diary afterwards, that it had gone splendidly.
There is a specific quality of silence that follows catastrophe. Not the silence of peace, or of rest, or of a world holding its breath in anticipation of something beautiful. It is a heavier silence than any of those. The silence of aftermath, of streets where glass still glitters on the pavement in the cold morning light, of a city that has witnessed something it cannot entirely process and so simply goes quiet around it, the way a body goes quiet around a wound. The morning after Kristallnacht, Germany wore that silence, and somewhere in the middle of it, Joseph Goebbels sat at his desk and continued working. This is perhaps the detail that most precisely captures the nature of the man at the height of his power. Not the speech that had ignited the violence. That was, in its terrible way, consistent with everything he had been building toward for years. But the morning after, the capacity to sit in the silence of what had been done and feel not horror, not doubt, not the quiet insistence of conscience, but something closer to professional satisfaction. The mechanism had worked. The message had reached its target. The apparatus had performed as designed. He made notes. He issued directives. He moved on to the next thing. The next thing, in the months and years that followed Kristallnacht, was war. Hitler had been moving toward it with a patience and a clarity of intention that many around him had either failed to see or chosen not to. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 had been welcomed by many Austrians and met with limp protest by the international community. The absorption of the Sudetenland had followed, enabled by the appeasement at Munich that sent Neville Chamberlain home with his paper promise of peace and sent Hitler the signal that the Western powers would sacrifice almost anything to avoid confrontation. By the time German tanks rolled into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the die had been cast so long ago and so thoroughly that the actual beginning of the war felt less like a rupture than a confirmation. Goebbels' propaganda apparatus shifted to wartime operations with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a machine that had been designed with exactly this moment in mind. The ministry had spent 6 years refining its instruments, testing its methods, calibrating its understanding of how the German public received and processed information. It had built, in that time, the most comprehensive state media apparatus in the world, more total in its reach and more sophisticated in its methods than anything that had existed before it. And now, with a continental war underway and the full resources of the state behind him, Goebbels deployed that apparatus with everything he had. The early years of the war were, from a propaganda standpoint, almost embarrassingly easy. The German military campaigns of 1939 and 1940 were so swift, so complete, and so dramatically successful that the work of celebrating them required little embellishment. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark and Norway were occupied in April of 1940. France, which had held Germany at bay for 4 years in the previous war at a cost of millions of lives, fell in 6 weeks. 6 weeks! The speed was staggering, and the propaganda that accompanied it carried the natural energy of genuine triumph. The newsreels practically made themselves. The radio broadcasts practically wrote themselves. Goebbels had the rare and intoxicating experience of a propagandist whose job is made easier by reality. He managed even these easy victories with professional care, however. He understood that triumph, handled carelessly, breeds complacency, and complacency in a population at war is dangerous. So the victories were celebrated, yes, but always within a framework that kept the German public in a state of engaged vigilance rather than comfortable certainty. The enemy was always still threatening. The struggle was always still necessary. The sacrifices being asked of ordinary Germans were always being framed not as burdens, but as contributions to a historical destiny that made them meaningful. This was the consistent emotional architecture of his wartime broadcasts. Pride and purpose held in careful balance, never quite allowing the audience to relax completely.
He was also managing, with increasing sophistication, the relationship between domestic propaganda and international perception. The world was watching Germany, and Goebbels understood that the story Germany told about itself to foreign audiences needed to be subtly different from the story it told internally. For German consumption, the war was a righteous struggle for national survival and historical justice. For international consumption, particularly for audiences in neutral countries whose sympathies and resources might still be courted, the framing was more careful, more moderate, more attentive to the sensibilities of people who had not been marinated for 6 years in Nazi socialist ideology. He was, in both registers, working against a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, because while the propaganda machine was producing its carefully crafted version of events, other things were happening in the occupied territories, in the concentration camps, in the administrative machinery of racial policy that existed in a profound tension with the image of civilized, aggrieved, historically justified Germany that Goebbels was trying to project. He knew what was happening. His diaries make this clear, in passages that are written with a matter-of-factness that is itself a form of horror, the casual registration of atrocity in the same tone one might use to note the weather or record a meeting time. He knew. He continued. He built the illusion higher and stronger, with more detail and more craft, as the reality it was designed to conceal grew darker and more absolute. This is the central, defining act of his career as propagandist, not the early work of building the movement, not the cultural restructuring of the early Nazi years, but this sustained, deliberate, technically brilliant effort to maintain a coherent public narrative in the face of an accelerating catastrophe that he was simultaneously helping to engineer and helping to hide. The tools available to him were considerable and growing. By the early 1940s, the German radio network had been extended across occupied Europe, broadcasting in multiple languages to audiences in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia, and beyond. The press remained tightly controlled, its editors receiving daily guidance from the ministry on which stories to run, which to bury, which angles to emphasize, and which facts to omit. Every journalist in Germany understood without needing to be told explicitly where the boundaries were. The ones who tested them discovered quickly that the consequences were severe. Most did not test them. And yet, for all the sophistication of the apparatus, the fundamental challenge of Goebbels' position was growing, because propaganda, however brilliantly executed, cannot indefinitely substitute for reality. It can shape perception. It can delay recognition. It can manage the emotional temperature of a population living through events that, fully understood, would produce very different responses than the ones being manufactured. But it cannot, ultimately, change what is true. And the truth of Germany's military situation was beginning, slowly, and then less slowly, to diverge from the story being told about it. The turning point was coming, and Goebbels, who had spent his entire career staying 3 steps ahead of reality, was about to discover that some realities move faster than even the most gifted propagandist can manage.
Stalingrad arrived in the winter of 1942 and 1943 like a verdict that the court of history had been deliberating for years. The German Sixth Army, which had pushed deep into the Soviet Union with the same apparently unstoppable momentum that had characterized the early campaigns in the West, found itself encircled in the ruins of a city on the Volga River, trapped by a Soviet counteroffensive of breathtaking scale and audacity, ground down through weeks and then months of fighting so brutal, so total, so devoid of anything resembling mercy that the word battle seems almost insufficient to describe it. It was less a battle than a consumption. The city ate the army. And when it was finally over, in February of 1943, roughly 300,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, whom Hitler had promoted to the highest military rank in the German army on the assumption that a field marshal would die rather than surrender, surrendered. For Joseph Goebbels, Stalingrad was the first truly serious test of his apparatus under conditions of genuine catastrophe. Everything before, the setbacks, the complications, the moments when reality had strained against the narrative, had been manageable, had been, in the end, containable within a framework of overall German military success that provided the essential foundation for the propaganda to rest on. Stalingrad removed that foundation. For the first time, the German public was being asked to absorb not a temporary difficulty or a strategic repositioning, but an unambiguous, catastrophic defeat. 300,000 men gone. He could not hide it. This, perhaps more than anything else, demonstrates the limits of even the most total propaganda apparatus, that reality at sufficient scale forces its way through. The families of 300,000 soldiers knew that their fathers and husbands and sons had been at Stalingrad. The letters had stopped coming. The official notifications were arriving. The absence, that most undeniable of facts, was present in hundreds of thousands of German homes in a way that no broadcast or newspaper could address or redirect. The knowledge was already there in the texture of daily life before Goebbels had decided what to do with it. What he did with it was, characteristically, audacious. He made the decision, against the instincts of some within the regime who wanted the defeat minimized or obscured, to lean into it. Not to celebrate it, obviously, but to use it, to take the weight of Stalingrad and transform it, through the alchemy of his particular genius, from a symbol of failure into a symbol of sacrifice, from a story about German defeat into a story about the existential stakes of the struggle, about what would happen to Germany, to Europe, to Western civilization itself if the fight against Bolshevism was not carried on with total, unflinching commitment. The speech he gave at the Berlin Sportpalast on the 18th of February 1943, just weeks after the formal German surrender at Stalingrad, is considered by historians of propaganda to be among the most technically accomplished pieces of political oratory in the 20th century. It is a deeply uncomfortable thing to acknowledge that skill of this order was deployed in this service, but the acknowledgement is necessary because sanitizing the competence of evil is its own kind of dishonesty. The speech lasted nearly 2 hours. The Sportpalast was packed with 12,000 carefully selected audience members, the party faithful, wounded soldiers, workers, representatives of every segment of German society that the regime wanted to appear united. The event was broadcast live on radio across Germany and occupied Europe. Goebbels worked the crowd with the mastery of a virtuoso musician who knows his instrument completely. He began quietly, almost conversationally, drawing his audience in with the intimacy that had always been one of his greatest rhetorical gifts. He built slowly, layer by layer, constructing an emotional architecture that moved from acknowledgement of difficulty through righteous indignation to soaring, almost ecstatic defiance. He asked his audience 10 rhetorical questions. Do you believe in the Führer? Do you want total war? Are you resolved to follow the Führer through thick and thin? And the crowd worked to a pitch of emotional intensity that bypassed rational response entirely, roared back its answers with a unanimity that shook the building. He had turned a catastrophic military defeat into a rallying cry for total war. He had taken the heaviest possible blow and used it as a weapon. It was, in purely technical terms, a remarkable achievement. And it is worth sitting with the discomfort of that recognition, the discomfort of understanding that the skills we admire in communicators, the skills of empathy and rhythm and emotional intelligence, are not inherently good. They're tools. And in the hands of Joseph Goebbels, in the Sportpalast on that February evening, they were tools being used to prolong a war that would kill millions more people before it ended. The concept of total war that he proclaimed that night was not merely rhetorical. It had practical implications that would reshape German society in the months that followed. The economy was restructured around military production with an intensity that had, until Stalingrad, been resisted by elements within the regime who feared the impact on civilian morale. Consumer goods production was cut. Women were mobilized into the workforce in greater numbers. The remaining pleasures and comforts of ordinary German life were systematically reduced in the name of the war effort. And Goebbels managed the public communication of all of this with the same careful attentiveness he brought to everything, framing sacrifice as honor, framing hardship as shared purpose, framing the diminishment of individual comfort as the price of collective survival. He was also, in this period, beginning to accumulate political power beyond his ministerial role.
The war had reshuffled the hierarchy around Hitler in ways that opened space for Goebbels to expand his influence. Some of the older guard, men who had been rivals or counterweights to his authority, were losing ground as military failures eroded their standing. Goebbels, by contrast, had demonstrated at Stalingrad that he was indispensable precisely when things went wrong, that his value to the regime was not merely ornamental, not merely the work of fair-weather messaging, but something more essential: the ability to hold a narrative together under pressure, to keep a population functional and committed when the facts were actively working against both. Hitler noticed. Their relationship, which had always been the central axis of Goebbels' professional existence, deepened in these wartime years into something that was less the star-struck devotion of the early convert, and more the complex, mutually dependent partnership of two people who have been through too much together to easily imagine existing apart. He remained devoted. The diary entries about Hitler retain, even in the darkest years, a quality of almost filial reverence that never entirely disappeared. But the devotion was now seasoned with a clearer-eyed understanding of the man, his moods, his irrationalities, his increasing detachment from military reality, the way the war was changing him into something harder and more remote than the compelling figure who had wept over in that provincial meeting hall decades before. He managed Hitler too, carefully, skillfully, with the same sensitivity to emotional temperature that he brought to managing the German public. He knew when to push and when to wait. He knew which arguments would land and which would provoke. He understood the architecture of the Führer's psychology in ways that few others did, and he used that understanding not to challenge or redirect — he was never capable of genuine opposition — but to navigate, to find the path between what he needed and what Hitler would allow, and to move along that path with the minimum of friction. It was, in its way, another performance, another act of careful, sustained management, another room in the vast theater of illusion that his life had become. Outside that theater, the war was turning in ways that no amount of rhetorical brilliance could ultimately reverse. The Allied landings in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, the grinding Soviet advance from the east, the growing Allied air campaign that was bringing the war literally to the rooftops of German cities. The physical reality of the conflict was beginning to reach ordinary Germans in ways that the most carefully managed radio broadcast could not fully absorb or redirect. Bombs did not care about narrative framing. Ruins did not respond to rhetorical questions. The dead did not rally. And yet, he continued. Every morning the ministry opened. Every evening the broadcasts went out. Every week the newsreels were screened. Every day the German press received its instructions and followed them. The machine ran, the illusion was maintained, imperfectly and with increasing effort, but maintained. Because for Joseph Goebbels, stopping was not a concept that his psychology had room for. The apparatus was not merely a tool he used, it was, by this point, the structure within which he existed. To stop the machine would be asking what remained without it. And that was a question he was not, even now, prepared to face.
By 1944, the geography of the war had begun to tell its own story, with a clarity that no propaganda apparatus, however sophisticated, could entirely rewrite. The maps on the walls of the Reich Chancellery showed German lines that were moving in the wrong direction, east to west in the Soviet Union, south to north in Italy, and after the 6th of June, when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy with a scale and organization that announced, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Western Front had truly opened, in every direction simultaneously. Germany was being compressed, slowly then less slowly. The enormous territorial gains of the early war years were being surrendered, kilometer by kilometer, in a retreat that the official communications described as strategic repositioning, and that everyone with access to a map understood as something else entirely. Goebbels navigated this period with a kind of grim, almost admirable professional tenacity. The tools of optimism, the language of inevitable victory, the imagery of unstoppable German military power were no longer available to him in any credible form. He had to find a different register, and he found it in something older and more elemental than triumph. He found it in endurance, in the deep, particular stubbornness of a people who have been told and have come to believe that the alternative to fighting on is annihilation. he shifted the entire emotional architecture of his public communication from the bright, forward-moving energy of conquest to the darker, more sustainable energy of existential resistance. We fight not because we are winning, the messaging implied, but because we must. Because to stop is to cease to exist. It was, rhetorically speaking, a masterful pivot, and it worked, at least partially, for longer than it perhaps should have. The German public's continued functioning, its willingness to go to work in the factories, to send its remaining sons to the front, to absorb the bombing raids and the shortages and the mounting grief of loss upon loss, was not simply the product of coercion, though coercion was certainly present and growing. It was also the product of a genuine psychological commitment that Goebbels had spent over a decade carefully cultivating. People who've been told a story about themselves, about their identity, their destiny, their enemies, their purpose, do not easily lay that story down, even when the evidence against it accumulates to crushing weight. The story has become part of them. Abandoning it means abandoning something that feels like the self. This is the most lasting and most troubling lesson of Goebbels' work. Not the specific techniques, the radio management, the film production, the rally choreography, but the deeper insight about the relationship between narrative and identity. That if you can make a story feel like someone's own story, feel like the expression of who they fundamentally are, rather than something imposed on them from outside, then the story acquires a resilience that straightforward belief never could. People will defend their own story against contradictory evidence with an energy they would never bring to defending a mere opinion. Because to admit the story is wrong is to admit that the self built around it needs to be rebuilt, and that is one of the most frightening things a human being can face. The assassination attempt on Hitler's life on the 20th of July, 1944, the bomb placed under the conference table at the Wolfslayer by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, provided Goebbels with one of the last genuinely useful propaganda moments of the war. Hitler survived, through a combination of luck and the structural peculiarities of the room in which the bomb detonated, and Goebbels, who was in Berlin when the attempt occurred, and who responded to the confusion of that afternoon with a decisiveness and a clarity of political instinct that arguably helped prevent the coup from succeeding, emerged from the episode with his standing significantly enhanced. His role in the hours immediately following the explosion deserves attention, because it reveals a side of Goebbels that the purely cultural history of his propaganda work sometimes obscures, the side of the hard, practical, political operator who could act without hesitation under pressure. When the bomb went off and communication from the Wolfslayer was temporarily disrupted, elements of the conspirators' plan, Operation Valkyrie, began to be executed in Berlin, with orders going out to military units that Hitler was dead and a new government was being formed. Goebbels, from his Berlin apartment, worked the phones with ferocious energy, reaching military commanders, sowing doubt about the conspiracy's claims, buying time until direct contact with Hitler could be established and the Führer's survival confirmed. He was, in those critical hours, one of the primary reasons the coup failed to gain the momentum it needed. The personal reward was significant. Hitler's trust in him, already substantial, deepened after July 20th into something close to unconditional. In the increasingly paranoid atmosphere of the late war period, when Hitler's circle contracted and the dictator's suspicion extended even to long-standing loyalists, Goebbels remained within the innermost ring of confidence. He was appointed Reich Plenipotentiary for total war in late July 1944, a role that gave him sweeping authority over the domestic war economy and effectively made him the most powerful figure in Germany after Hitler himself. It was the largest accumulation of formal power he had ever held. It arrived at the moment when the power to shape events was almost entirely gone. Because what total war plenipotentiary meant in the summer and autumn of 1944 was the power to organize the final squeezing of a society that had already given almost everything it had. The power to close theaters and concert halls and redirect their staff to war industries. The power to extend working hours and reduce rations and eliminate what remained of the ordinary comforts that made daily life bearable. The power, in essence, to strip away the last of the cultural and social infrastructure that Goebbels himself had spent years using as instruments of public mood management. To dismantle, in the interest of military production, the very apparatus of distraction and emotional regulation that had helped keep German society functional through the long middle years of the war.
There is a bitter irony in this that Goebbels, with his literary sensibility, must have felt at some level. The minister of culture dismantling culture, the architect of the people's entertainment closing the theaters, the man who had understood, better than almost anyone, that a population needed stories and music and the small daily rituals of civilian life to sustain its psychological coherence, that man now stripping those things away in the name of a war effort that he understood, in the private chambers of his diary, was almost certainly lost. Almost certainly. Because even in the autumn of 1944, even with the Soviet army pushing toward the eastern borders of Germany proper and the Western Allies advancing through France towards the Rhine, Goebbels had not fully surrendered the possibility of a different outcome. He clung, and this is perhaps the most revealing thing about the psychology of the true believer in extremis, to not a realistic military scenario, but to historical analogy. He returned repeatedly in his diary and in his conversations with Hitler to the example of Frederick the Great, the Prussian king who had faced seemingly impossible military odds in the 7 Years' War and had survived through a combination of tenacity, enemy miscalculation, and what historians diplomatically call the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, the sudden death of a key enemy that changed the entire strategic picture. He was waiting, in other words, for a miracle, for something to break the coalition arrayed against Germany, for Roosevelt to die or Churchill to fall, or the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union to fracture along its ideological fault lines. He was waiting for history to provide, as it occasionally did, the unexpected reversal that transformed apparent defeat into eventual survival. It was not an entirely irrational hope. Stranger things had happened in the long record of European warfare, but it was a hope sustained more by the need to keep believing than by any sober assessment of probabilities. It was in the end the last and most personal act of propaganda he ever performed, the story he told himself in the darkening final months to keep moving forward into the end.
There is a specific quality to the final chapters of lives lived at extremity, a compression, a narrowing, as though the world itself is slowly closing its walls around the person at the center of the story, drawing in from all directions simultaneously, reducing the available space until what remains is barely enough to stand in. For Joseph Goebbels, the final months of his life had exactly that quality. The broad horizons of the early Nazi years, the sense of infinite possibility, of history being seized and shaped by willing hands, had contracted to the dimensions of a bunker beneath a burning city. And yet, even there, even in that compressed and darkening space, the essential Goebbels persisted, still writing, still broadcasting, still constructing with the last of his considerable energy the story that he needed the world to believe. The winter of 1944 into 1945 moved with the terrible momentum of an ending that everyone could feel, but that the official narrative continued to deny. The Soviet winter offensive, launched in January 1945, was on a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before it. 1.5 million soldiers advancing across a front of hundreds of kilometers, sweeping through Poland and into the eastern territories of Germany with a speed that left the defending forces reeling. Cities fell. Refugees streamed westward in the brutal cold. Millions of German civilians, carrying what they could, abandoning everything else, moving away from an advancing force whose conduct in the territories it entered was shaped, at least in part, by the accumulated fury of what had been done in the Soviet Union in the years of German occupation. The circle was closing, and the closing was not gentle. Goebbels managed the communication of this catastrophe with the last reserves of his professional craft. The refugees were framed as victims of Bolshevik brutality, which many of them genuinely were, in broadcasts designed to harden German resistance by making the cost of defeat feel viscerally real. The atrocities committed by Soviet forces in towns like Nemmersdorf in East Prussia were documented and publicized with a thoroughness that the regime had never applied to its own atrocities, presented as evidence of the fate that awaited all Germans if the defense collapsed. It was, in purely propagandistic terms, effective. Fear is a powerful motivator, and the fear being generated was not entirely manufactured. The violence was real. The danger was real. Only the context, the careful omission of what Germany had done to bring this retribution into being, was false.
He was also, in these final months, increasingly assuming functions that went beyond propaganda into direct political and administrative authority over the defense of Berlin itself. Hitler had appointed him Reich Defense Commissioner for Berlin in 1944, adding this responsibility to his already considerable portfolio. As the Soviet advance brought the war literally to the outskirts of the capital, this role transformed from an administrative title into something immediate and desperate: the organization of the city's defense with whatever resources remained, which were increasingly inadequate, increasingly composed of old men and young boys pressed into service by a regime that had consumed its actual military capacity and was now reaching into the civilian population for its last reserves of human material. He visited the front lines. This detail surprises people who know Goebbels primarily as a desk-bound manipulator of information, and the surprise is itself revealing of how completely his public image as propagandist has overshadowed the other dimensions of his character. He went to the defensive positions around Berlin. He spoke to the soldiers and the Volkssturm fighters, the militia of old men and teenagers who represented the final mobilization of German civilian life into military service. He moved among them with the physical ease of a man who had spent decades in crowds, who understood instinctively how to make each individual in an audience feel personally addressed. He shook hands. He listened. He brought to these exhausted and frightened men at the edges of a collapsing front the one thing he had always been best at providing: the feeling that their sacrifice meant something, that someone in authority saw them and valued them and believed their endurance mattered. Whether he still believed it himself is one of the questions that the historical record cannot fully answer. His diary entries from this period are among the most psychologically complex he ever produced, oscillating between passages of almost delusional optimism in which he rehearses the Frederick the Great analogy and searches for signs that the coalition against Germany is fracturing, and passages of a darker, more lucid quality that read like a man beginning, very slowly and very reluctantly, to look at what is actually in front of him. He writes about the destruction of Berlin with a grief that feels genuine. The city he had shaped and dominated for nearly 2 decades, now being systematically reduced to rubble by Allied bombing campaigns that operated by this stage of the war with virtual impunity over German skies. He writes about the German people with a tenderness that coexists in the same diary entries, with a ruthlessness about their expendability that is chilling in its casualness. He was sleeping less, eating less. The physical toll of the final years was visible to those around him. The already slight figure grown thinner, the restless energy that had always characterized him now carrying an edge of something more frantic, more driven by the absence of alternatives than by the presence of purpose. Magda, who had returned to his side after the Barawa episode and remained there through everything that followed with a loyalty whose nature historians have debated endlessly, was deteriorating too, physically ill, emotionally exhausted, carrying the weight of 6 children in a city under siege, and a marriage that had never been what either of them had perhaps hoped it might be. The children were there: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. 6 children ranging from 12 years down to 4, all of whose names began with H in honor of Hitler, a detail that speaks volumes about the degree to which the family's identity had been constructed around the regime. They were in Berlin, in the bunker, in the final room, and what their parents were planning for them was something that Goebbels had apparently decided upon well before the end made it imminent, a decision so absolute, so final, and so revealing of the particular madness of total ideological commitment that it requires its own space, its own careful attention, its own long moment of quiet reflection. But that is still a few weeks ahead. For now, in the early months of 1945, there was still the daily work of the ending, still the broadcasts, still the ministry, still the performance of a reality that was dissolving faster than it could be reconstructed. And Joseph Goebbels, the boy from Rheydt who had wanted nothing more to matter, was mattering in the most terrible way imaginable, at the center of a catastrophe of his own making, in a city that was burning, in a story that had no good ending left available to it. Only the end itself remained, and it was coming now, with the unstoppable, indifferent momentum of a history that had finally run out of patience with the illusions built to contain it.
April in Berlin, in the year 1945, was not the April of poetry or of seasonal renewal. It was not the April of blossoms along the Unter den Linden or of couples walking beside the Spree in the pale warmth of a returning sun. It was an April of rubble and smoke and the distant, then not so distant, then immediate percussion of artillery that had been moving westward for months and had now arrived at the edges of the city itself. The Soviet forces that encircled Berlin in the third week of April represented the largest concentration of military power ever assembled against a single urban target in human history. Over 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces, pressing inward from all directions simultaneously with the methodical, overwhelming force of an ending that could no longer be delayed or deflected or reframed. Inside the city, the defense was a study in organized desperation. The regular military units that remained were exhausted, under-equipped, and operating under a command structure that had become increasingly detached from military reality as Hitler's direct management of tactical decisions grew more erratic and more divorced from what was actually possible on the ground. The Volkssturm fighters, those old men and boys who had been pressed into service in the final mobilization, held their positions with a courage that deserves to be acknowledged, even as the cause that demanded it deserves every condemnation history has given it. The civilian population sheltered in basements and subway tunnels, emerging into streets that were being contested block by block, living in the strange, compressed temporality of people who know that something enormous is ending, but do not yet know exactly what will be left when it does. Goebbels had moved with Hitler into the Führer bunker, that complex of underground rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden that had become, in the final weeks, the operational center of whatever remained of the German government. It was not physically a dramatic space. The rooms were small and functional, the ceilings low, the ventilation system providing a constant background hum that those who recorded their memories of it mentioned repeatedly, as though the bunker had its own mechanical breathing, its own underground pulse. The walls were damp, the lighting was artificial. Above ground, the city was being destroyed. Below ground, the remnants of a regime gathered in these small rooms and continued with a surreal persistence the rituals of governance and military command that had long since been separated from any meaningful power to affect events. Hitler was visibly deteriorating. Those who saw him in these final weeks, and the accounts are numerous enough to be treated as reliable in their broad outlines, describe a man aged far beyond his 55 years, his left hand trembling with what appears to have been the advancing symptoms of Parkinson's disease, his posture stooped, his face gray and slack with exhaustion, and something that those who knew him well described as a kind of inner withdrawal. The burning certainty that had defined him, that quality of absolute conviction that had drawn Goebbels and so many others into his orbit decades before, was still present in flashes, still capable of igniting into the old furious energy when provoked, but the flashes were shorter now, and the spaces between them longer and darker. Goebbels remained. While others in the inner circle were finding reasons to leave Berlin, Hermann Goering fled to Bavaria. Heinrich Himmler was conducting secret surrender negotiations with the Western Allies. Albert Speer made his farewells. Goebbels stayed. He stayed with a completeness and a deliberateness that went beyond mere loyalty, beyond the calculations of political self-interest that had always run beneath the surface of his devotion. He stayed because, in some absolute and irreversible way, there was no longer a distinction for him between his own existence and the existence of what he had served. The ideology was not something he believed, it was something he had become, and ideologies do not negotiate their own survival. They persist or they end entirely. He was still writing. The diary, that obsessive, lifelong companion, continued to receive its entries in the bunker, shorter now, more fragmentary, but present. He was also, remarkably, still producing propaganda. Radio broadcasts continued from Berlin even as the Soviet forces closed in, carrying his voice into whatever German homes still had power and still had functioning receivers. The broadcasts were extraordinary documents of a particular kind of madness, the madness of a narrative maintained past the point where any reasonable person would have recognized that the narrative was over. He spoke of resistance, of the turning of the tide, of historical examples of miraculous reversals.
He spoke in the voice he had cultivated over 2 decades of professional communication, calm, certain, emotionally resonant, constructed to make the listener feel that the person speaking knew something they did not, saw a larger picture that made the present darkness comprehensible and temporary. He was speaking into an absence. The Germany that had listened to that voice for 12 years, the Germany of the Volksempfänger in every living room, of the carefully managed newsreels, of the choreographed rallies and the total cultural apparatus, that Germany was gone. Its cities were ruins, its armies were defeated or dissolving, its people were hiding in basements, fleeing on roads, dying in the rubble of a dream that had consumed everything it touched. The broadcasts went out. Whether anyone received them, and what they made of them if they did, is beyond knowing. On the 22nd of April, Hitler made the decision to remain in Berlin until the end. It was, in its way, the only decision fully consistent with everything he had always been, the refusal of compromise, the absolute commitment to a single narrative regardless of cost. He would not flee, he would not surrender, he would die in Berlin, and Berlin would die with him, or something like that. Goebbels received this decision with a response that tells us almost everything about the final state of his psychology. He was relieved. The uncertainty of what to do, where to go, how to navigate an ending that had no good options, all of that collapsed into the clean simplicity of a decision made by the man he had always allowed him to make his decisions for him. They would stay. They would see it through, whatever that meant. Magda brought the children to the bunker. This is the fact that sits at the center of the final chapter of the Goebbels story with a weight that resists easy language. 6 children, the oldest 12, the youngest 4, brought into an underground room beneath a burning city by their mother and their father, who had already decided what was going to happen to them. The decision had apparently been Magda's, at least in its initial formation, or so the historical record suggests, though the precise division of responsibility between the parents is something that neither of them left clear enough documentation to resolve. What is clear is that both of them had arrived at this point at the same conclusion, that their children would not survive into a world without Nazi socialism, that a world without Nazi socialism was not a world in which their children should be required to live. The logic, if it can be called that, was the logic of the total true believer carried to its absolute terminus. The ideology had consumed not just their own lives, but their capacity to imagine their children's lives as separate from it. The children were not, in this terrible calculus, individuals with their own futures to discover. They were extensions of a story that was ending, and when the story ended, they would end with it. It is, in the entire landscape of the Nazi period's human horror, one of the most intimate and most devastating expressions of what total ideological possession ultimately means. Not the mass atrocities, those were vast and abstract in their scale, mediated by distance and bureaucracy and the diffusion of individual responsibility across enormous systems. This was 6 children and 2 parents in a small underground room. This was the ideology made personal, made domestic, made absolutely final. The children played in the bunker. They were told by the adults around them, who could not bring themselves to tell the truth, that they were going on a journey, that the noise above was something that would pass. Helga, the oldest, was apparently not entirely convinced. Accounts suggest she was old enough and perceptive enough to sense that something was profoundly wrong, that the adults around her were performing a normalcy that had no relationship to what was actually happening. But she was 12, and the adults were her parents, and so she moved through those last days in the way that children move through adult incomprehensibility, with a watchful, uncertain trust that the people responsible for her understood something she did not. She was heartbreakingly wrong about what that understanding meant for her.
The last days of April 1945 moved with a strange, dissociated quality that survivors of the bunker described in remarkably consistent terms, a kind of suspended unreality, as though time itself had thickened and slowed in that underground space, as though the ordinary markers of hours and days had lost their meaning in a place where daylight never entered, and the only measure of passing time was the changing intensity of the artillery that shook the ceiling and sent fine dust drifting down onto the maps and the papers and the faces of the people gathered below. There were conferences that accomplished nothing. There were meals eaten with the careful formality of people maintaining ritual in the absence of meaning. There were conversations that circled back on themselves, returning again and again to the same points, the same arguments, the same desperate rehearsals of possibilities that everyone in the room understood were no longer real. Hitler's birthday was the 20th of April. He was 56 years old. The occasion was marked in the bunker with a gathering that carried, by all accounts, the particular sadness of a celebration that everyone knows is the last one. The kind of gathering where the smiles are real enough, but the eyes behind them are doing different work entirely. Several of the senior figures who attended used the occasion to make their final farewells, slipping away from Berlin in the days that followed with the careful casualness of people who have decided to survive and are not yet ready to say so openly. Goebbels did not slip away. He remained. He shook Hitler's hand on his birthday and looked into the eyes of the man he had devoted his life to, and found there, still, something that held him, some last ember of the fire that had ignited in that provincial meeting hall a quarter-century before. On the 28th of April, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker map room. It was a marriage of hours. Eva Braun would be dead within a day. Goebbels and Martin Bormann served as witnesses. The ceremony was followed by a small gathering in Hitler's private quarters, where champagne was drunk and stories were told about the early days of the movement, those long-ago years in Munich and Berlin that must have felt, in the compressed and terrible intimacy of the bunker, like stories from another world entirely, which, in every meaningful sense, they were. Hitler spent the night of the 28th and the early hours of the 29th dictating his final political testament. It was, in its way, a characteristic document, unrepentant, delusional in its continued attribution of the war and its consequences to Jewish conspiracy, ending with an exhortation to the German people and their future leaders to continue their racial struggle above all else. He had learned nothing. This, too, is part of the record that must be held. In the face of everything, the tens of millions dead, the continent destroyed, the civilization shattered, the testament contained not a single moment of genuine reckoning, only the same story told one final time in a small room underground by a man who had never been able to hear any other. Goebbels was named, in the testament, as the new Reich Chancellor. It was an appointment that would last approximately one day before he too was dead, a fact he knew perfectly well when he received it, and that he accepted with the equanimity of a man who had already made his final decision. He wrote his own addendum to Hitler's testament, a document that remains one of the most psychologically revealing things he ever produced. In it, he explained his decision to remain in Berlin and to die there, framing it in the language of loyalty and historical example, the loyal lieutenant who would not abandon his leader, the servant of an idea who could not survive the idea's defeat. It was, like everything he wrote, carefully constructed, emotionally calibrated, designed to be read by posterity with a particular effect in mind. But beneath the construction, something else was visible, a tiredness. Not the tiredness of a man who has worked too hard or slept too little, though both of those things were also true. A deeper tiredness. The tiredness of a man who has been performing without interruption for 20 years, performing belief, performing certainty, performing the absolute conviction that the story was true and the cause was right and the suffering was meaningful, and who has, in the final underground room, run out of audience. There was no one left to perform for. Hitler was retreating into his last hours. The ministry was gone. The radio was silent, or nearly so. The machinery of illusion had finally, completely stopped. What remained was the man. And the man, stripped of his apparatus and his audience and his lifelong habit of constructing reality through language, was someone that history had never had much opportunity to see directly. He was 57 years old. He was thin and exhausted and had been living underground for weeks. He had a wife who was preparing to die, and 6 children who did not know what was about to happen to them. He had devoted everything he had, his intelligence, his creativity, his emotional capacity, his moral sense, every gift he had been given and every dream he had ever carried, to a cause that ended in the most comprehensive catastrophe in modern European history. Whether he felt in those last hours anything that resembled regret in the ordinary human sense
regret not as political calculation but as genuine moral reckoning, is something that the record does not allow us to know with certainty. The diary, that lifelong companion, ends before the final days. The accounts of those who were with him describe a man who remained composed, even calm, in a way that some interpreted as courage, and others as the final expression of a psychology so thoroughly organized around a single absolute commitment that its removal left not grief, but simply emptiness, a man-shaped space where a true believer used to be. On the evening of the 1st of May, 1945, the day after Hitler and Eva Braun had died in the Führer bunker, the Goebbels children were put to bed in the bunker room by their mother. Magda had obtained through the bunker's medical staff a supply of morphine. She sedated the children as they slept. Then, with a method that the historical record describes but that this narration will not, she ensured that none of them would wake. Helga was 12, Hildegard was 11, Helmut was 9, Holdine was 8, Hedwig was 6, and Heidrun was 4. Their names are worth saying. Their ages are worth knowing, because they were not abstractions, they were not symbols or casualties or footnotes. They were children who had played in the bunker and been told they were going on a journey, and who had trusted the adults responsible to them with the complete, irreplaceable trust that children extend to their parents before the world has taught them that trust can be betrayed in ways this absolute. After the children, Magda and Joseph Goebbels went out into the Reich Chancellery Garden. The city above them was burning and shuddering with the last of the fighting. The sky, by all accounts nearby, was lit with fire and the red-orange glow of a city that had been consuming itself for weeks. They died there in the garden, by their own hands, in the ruins of the world they had helped build and helped to destroy. He was 57 years old. He had been, in the fullest and terrible sense of the word, consequential. He had shaped the information environment of an entire nation for over a decade. He had helped bring a democratic republic to its knees and replace it with a totalitarian state. He had engineered the cultural exclusion and dehumanization of millions of people, providing the ideological and emotional infrastructure without which the industrial murder of the Holocaust could not have proceeded as it did. He had prolonged a war that killed tens of millions by keeping a population functional and committed long past the point where the rational assessment of their situation should have produced a different response. In the end, he killed his own children rather than allow them to exist in a world that did not conform to the story he had spent his life constructing. The novel that he had written as a young man, Michael, the semi-autobiographical work that publishers had rejected in the early 1920s, was eventually published after he joined the Nazi Party and acquired the power to ensure its publication. It found readers finally. It got its stage. Everything he had wanted in those early years of painful striving, the audience, the recognition, the sense of being at the center of something that mattered, he had obtained, at a cost so enormous that the word cost can begin to not contain it.
There's a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a very long story, not the silence of resolution, of a narrative that has arrived at a place of peace or understanding or earned rest, but the silence of aftermath, of a room after everyone has left it, of a city that has been emptied not by choice but by catastrophe. Berlin, in the weeks and months after the 8th of May, 1945, the day Germany formally surrendered and the war in Europe ended, wore exactly that silence. Among the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, among the rubble of the Wilhelmplatz where the ministry had stood, among the vast physical wreckage of a capital that had been fought over street by street and reduced in the process to something that looked less like a city than like the memory of one, the silence settled like ash, heavy, fine, everywhere. Joseph Goebbels had been dead for a week. His body and Magda's had been found in the Chancellery Garden by Soviet soldiers, partially burned as per the instructions he had left, though the burning had been incomplete and the bodies were identifiable. The children were found in their bunker room. Photographs were taken. The photographs exist. They are not reproduced here because some things deserve the protection of not being images, deserve to remain, for the purposes of this narration, words,
facts held at a human distance that allows them to be processed without the numbing that comes from visual confrontation with horror at its most intimate. The world that emerged from the rebel of the Second World War was a world that needed urgently and practically to understand how what had happened had happened. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945 and continued through 1946, were in part an attempt to answer that question through the mechanism of law, to establish individual accountability for crimes of such scale that the legal frameworks available had to be expanded simply to accommodate them. Goebbels was not tried at Nuremberg. He had ensured by his death that he would not be. But his work was examined. His methods were analyzed. His ministry was dissected with the careful attention of people who understood that what he had built was not merely a historical curiosity, but a warning, a detailed operational blueprint for the manipulation of mass consciousness that the 20th century, still young and already exhausted by catastrophe, could not afford to ignore. The scholars and psychologists and political theorists who examined his work in the years after the war found in it things that disturbed them not because they were alien, but because they were familiar. The techniques Goebbels had developed and deployed, the emotional appeal over rational argument, the repetition of simple messages across multiple platforms, the construction of an enemy to unify the in-group, the management of information environments to prevent the formation of alternative narratives, the cultivation of parasocial intimacy through broadcast media. These were not inventions that died with their inventor. They were discoveries, and discoveries, once made, belong to whoever finds a use for them. The post-war decades were, in many ways, a sustained conversation about this inheritance. Democratic societies rebuilt their institutions with an awareness of what propaganda could do, with a commitment to free press, independent judiciary, pluralistic cultural life, the structures of accountability and contradiction that Goebbels had dismantled so efficiently in the early 1930s. The understanding was that these structures were not merely ornamental features of a healthy society, but its immune system, the mechanisms by which a body politic recognized and resisted the particular infection that had consumed Germany. They were worth protecting. They were worth the inconvenience they sometimes caused, the messiness and inefficiency of a public square where no single voice could silence all the others. And yet the conversation did not end, could not end, because the world that emerged from 1945 was not a world that had solved the problem Goebbels represented. It was a world that had named the problem, had looked at it directly, had committed with varying degrees of sincerity and success to guarding against its recurrence. But the underlying vulnerabilities that Goebbels had identified and exploited, the human susceptibility to narrative over evidence, to emotional certainty over uncomfortable complexity, to the comfort of a simple story that names the enemy and promises the cure, those vulnerabilities did not disappear with the regime that had exploited them. They remained, as they always had been, part of the architecture of human psychology, available to whoever understood them well enough to use them. The technology evolved. Radio gave way to television. Television gave way to the internet. The internet gave way to the social media landscape of the early 21st century, a communication environment of a complexity and reach that Goebbels could not have imagined, but whose fundamental dynamics he would have recognized immediately. The shortening of attention spans, the premium placed on emotional resonance over factual accuracy, the algorithmic amplification of content that provokes strong feeling, regardless of whether that feeling is connected to anything true. The formation of information communities so internally consistent and externally sealed that the question of whether the shared narrative corresponds to external reality becomes for those inside it genuinely difficult to answer. He would have recognized all of it. He might, in some dark corner of historical imagination, admired it. The scale, the reach, the intimacy of a medium that delivers its messages not into the family living room, but into the individual pocket, available at every waking moment, responsive to personal preference in ways that make the old radio management look crude by comparison. He would have understood immediately and completely both the opportunity and the danger that such a landscape represents. He had spent his career in exactly that understanding of the gap between information and belief, between what is true and what feels true, between the world as it is and the world as it can be made to appear. This is why his story matters, not as a historical curiosity, not as a portrait of individual evil satisfying in its distance from our own experience, but as a mirror, as an examination of something that is not safely located in the past, but is present, in various forms and with varying degrees of intensity, in the information landscape of the contemporary world. The mechanisms he identified are not Nazi mechanisms. They are human mechanisms. They work because of how human beings process information and form beliefs and construct identity, processes that are not historical but biological, not German but universal. The question his story leaves us with is not the comfortable one, not how did this happen there to those people in that time. The uncomfortable question, the one that his story insists on asking if we are paying proper attention, is what are the conditions under which it could happen here, to us, in this time? What are the narratives we have accepted without examination? What are the enemies we have been given whose function is less to be understood than to be feared? What are the information environments we inhabit, and who shaped them, and toward what ends? What is the story we have been told about ourselves, and how much of it is true, and how would we know the difference? These are not easy answers. They are not questions that a bedtime narration can resolve, nor should it try. They are questions to carry gently into the quiet of your own reflection, to hold with the same careful attention that you might give any object of genuine weight. Not with anxiety, not with despair, but the steady, sober awareness that history is not a museum. It is a process, still running, still producing its outcomes, still shaped in part by the degree to which the people living through it are paying attention. Joseph Goebbels was brilliant, damaged, devoted, and monstrous. He was a man who had wanted to be a writer and became instead the author of a catastrophe. He was a man who understood human beings deeply and used that understanding without mercy. He was a man who loved his children and killed them. He was a man who believed in the end every word of the story he had spent his life telling, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him, because it means that the distance between a person and a true believer is not fixed, is not guaranteed, is not maintained automatically by intelligence or education or aesthetic sensibility or the love of literature or any of the other qualities we tend to associate with the kind of person who would never. The kind of person who would never is not a type. It is a choice, made daily, in the small decisions about what to question and what to accept, about which voices to trust and which to examine, about when to be comfortable and when to be unsettled. It is a choice that requires practice and attention, and the particular kind of courage that consists not of dramatic action, but of persistent, unglamorous honesty with the world and with oneself. That is what the story of Joseph Goebbels finally asks of us in the quiet of this evening, as the day releases its grip and the mind moves toward rest. Not horror, not despair, not the paralysis of confronting something too large and too dark to hold, but attention, careful, sustained, compassionate attention to the stories we are told, to the stories we tell ourselves, and to the small, daily, entirely human work of trying to know the difference. Sleep well. The world will need your clearer eyes in the morning.